Let's talk about one of the weirdest places on the planet. A country you can walk across in about 20 minutes, yet it has its own army, its own laws, and it's completely surrounded by the capital city of another nation. Of course, I'm talking about Vatican City. So, how on earth did this tiny kingdom end up right in the middle of Rome? Let's dig in. I mean, it's a total paradox, right? This tiny little plot of land is the global headquarters for a spiritual superpower. To really wrap your head around how that's even possible, we need to jump in a time machine and untangle almost 2,000 years of religion, politics, and power. All right, so here's our roadmap. First, we'll look at what makes the Vatican so unique today. Then we'll trace its roots all the way back from a Roman graveyard to a powerful kingdom. We'll see how that kingdom came crashing down, leading to a 60-year standoff, and how a deal with a dictator ultimately created the country we know today. And finally, we'll see how its promise of neutrality got put to the ultimate test right away. So let's start with that central puzzle. How do you get a sovereign kingdom tucked inside another country's capital city? So today, we all know the Vatican as the global headquarters for the Catholic Church. But it's also a real country, with its own laws, its own government, and, yep, that famous tiny army in the colorful uniforms. And its sovereignty isn't some modern fluke, it's actually the last tiny remnant of a once massive kingdom. To understand that, we have to go all the way back to the Roman Empire. So how did this all start? Well, believe it or not, it begins on a patch of land that, way back then, was basically an undesirable swamp just outside the walls of ancient Rome. In the 1st century, Vatican Hill was just a cemetery next to a Roman racetrack, the Circus of Nero, where tradition says St. Peter himself was martyred. Now fast forward about 250 years and the first Christian emperor, Constantine, builds a huge church right on top of St. Peter's tomb. All of a sudden, this spot is a sacred center. Then in the 8th century, things get political. The Pope gains direct control over a huge chunk of central Italy, creating the Papal States. And just like that, the head of the church was now also a king. And you really have to let that sink in. For over 1,000 years, the Pope wasn't just a spiritual leader. He was a king with real earthly power. He commanded armies, made treaties, and ruled a huge kingdom right from his capital in Rome. But you know how it goes. That kind of power doesn't last forever. As other European kings got stronger, they started to push back against the Pope's authority, and this clash would eventually shatter his kingdom. One of the first major blows came in the 14th century. After a bitter fight with the French king, a French pope was elected, and under a whole lot of pressure, moved the entire papal court from Rome to Avignon in France. For nearly 70 years, the popes lived there, seen by many as basically puppets of the French crown. This whole period, nicknamed the Babylonian captivity, seriously damaged the papacy's prestige and independence. But the final knockout punch came in the 1800s. A movement for Italian unification was sweeping the peninsula, and the Papal States were standing right in the way. So, in 1870, the armies of the new Kingdom of Italy marched into Rome, annexed the city, and declared it their capital. After 1,000 years, the Pope's kingdom was gone. He was left with nothing but the small patch of land around St. Peter's Basilica. The Pope's response to losing his entire kingdom was one of total defiance, and it kicked off a Cold War that would last for 6 decades. Pope Pius IX and the popes who followed him simply refused to accept this new reality. They declared themselves prisoners in the Vatican, literally locking themselves inside its walls and refusing to set foot in Rome, which they now called occupied territory. They even told Italian Catholics not to participate in the new government, which, as you can imagine, created a massive rift in the brand new country. This whole standoff became known as the Roman Question. How could Italy be truly whole when its most famous resident, the leader of millions of its citizens, was acting like a hostile prisoner inside its own capital? Something had to give. And a solution finally came from one of the 20th century's most controversial figures. By the 1920s, both sides were just plain tired of the standoff. Pope Pius XI wanted to guarantee the church's independence for good. And Italy's new fascist dictator, Benito Mussolini, he saw a chance to win over Italy's millions of Catholics and score a major political victory. So behind closed doors, they started to talk. The result was the Lateran Treaty, and it had 3 main parts. First, the big one, Italy officially recognized Vatican City as a brand new independent country. The Pope finally had his own sovereign territory again. Second, Catholicism became the official state religion of Italy, giving the church huge influence. And third, Italy agreed to pay up for the lands it had seized 60 years before. And we are talking about a huge financial deal. Italy paid the Pope 750 million lira in cash, plus over a billion more in state bonds, a massive sum at the time. In exchange for this tiny piece of land and a big check, the Pope finally recognized the Kingdom of Italy. The 60-year-long Roman question was over, and the world's smallest country was officially born. But this new state was created on the eve of the world's deadliest conflict, and its sovereignty would be tested almost immediately. You see, a core part of the treaty was the Pope's promise to remain politically neutral. This wasn't just a guideline, it was a legal obligation. So when World War II broke out, Pope Pius XII found himself in an impossibly difficult position, surrounded by fascist Italy and with Nazi Germany as its ally. His policy of neutrality during the Holocaust remains one of the most debated topics in modern history. And this is a deeply divisive issue. On one side, critics argue the Pope knew about the mass murder of Jews and refused to publicly condemn the Nazis. They see his silence as a moral failure, driven by a cold calculation to protect the Church's property and status. But on the other side, defenders argue that a public protest would have been pointless and would have only made things worse, leading to even more brutal retaliation against both Jews and Catholics. They claim the Pope's main goal was to protect the Church itself from a potential Nazi invasion, forcing him to work quietly behind the scenes. So, from a Roman graveyard to a medieval kingdom, a self-imposed prison to a state born from a deal with a dictator, the story of the Vatican shows just how tangled spiritual authority and political power can be. Which leaves us with a final question. In our modern world, what is the role for this strange and unique place, a tiny country with a massive global voice?